Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. A few weeks ago, I was driving home from work when I suddenly realized that I was not, in fact, driving home. I was in a completely different part of town. I had been lost in my own thoughts, preoccupied with a few sessions with clients from earlier in the day, and so preoccupied that I missed my exit and drove miles without even realizing it. It wasn't until I passed some unfamiliar road signs that I jolted into present awareness, feeling embarrassed and confused, and a little alarmed at how distracted I had just been. As I attempted to get my bearings, I kept thinking to myself, how did I get here? I had no recollection of the drive whatsoever. I couldn't remember if I'd stopped at a light or kept the speed limit. I couldn't remember what roads I'd just driven on or buildings I had just passed. I'd simply been driving on autopilot. Have you ever done this before? Driven a short distance only to realize that you ended up in a completely different place than you intended, and you can't recall the journey? After some honest reflection on my drive home, which was now much later than I had intended, naming my frustration and how silly I felt to myself and to God, I was actually able to sort of laugh at myself. And I was able to notice that something about my distraction and being startled out of preoccupation felt exposing on the soul level. As I made dinner and washed dishes, the Spirit of God began to use my lack of awareness in this story to open my eyes to a deeper truth. How often I can move through life in a similar fashion, living on autopilot, and I don't even know it. Scottish psychiatrist R.D. Laing once wrote, "Our lives are limited, not simply because we fail to take notice, but even more because we fail to notice that there is anything to notice in the first place." Right now, we are in a podcast series all about self-awareness. And as I mentioned in last week's episode, the hard thing about self-awareness is that we don't know what we don't know. It's not that I don't want to know certain things about myself. It's that I don't know that there is anything to know in the first place. And then, like this night driving home from work, something unexpected jolts me into awareness. Something in life that I didn't see coming startles me awake. And the realization comes whether I want to know it or not. I've been on autopilot. I've been operating by default. I'm not really sure how I got here, and I'm definitely not where I thought or ever intended to be. In last week's episode, we talked about the kind of self-awareness that we can choose. This is the kind of self-awareness that we can learn with practice and intentionality. But one of the things I've learned about self-awareness over the last few years is that self-awareness can also happen to us. It comes at certain times in our lives without our consent. Experiences of pain and crisis often becoming the catalyst for this deeper awakening. This is the kind of self-awareness that I want to talk about today. Now, hear me when I say this. I don't hold to the idea that God causes suffering and crisis. I just know that these things come along and God uses them. And He often uses them to facilitate our own encounter with some of the deepest parts of ourselves. I've also learned that it helps if we can understand the source of the crisis. In her book, When the Heart Waits, Sue Monk Kidd puts words to 3 different kinds of crises that our journeys hold: developmental transitions, intrusive events, and internal uprisings. I'm going to briefly touch on each kind here, and as you listen, I'd invite you to reflect on your own journey. Where in the terrain of your own life have you encountered 1 or 2 or all 3 of these crises? And where might you locate yourself right now? The first form of crisis is developmental transitions. In this kind of crisis, we move from one season to the next, the natural yet unavoidable result of passing time. Sue Monk Kidd describes developmental transitions like the tapered neck of an hourglass, difficult but necessary passages that we have to navigate in order to enter into the next stage of life. Whether it's entering adulthood or getting married or having kids or growing older, each of these transitions is also a time of termination, of loss and imbalance, and it's in this disruption that God often facilitates a deeper awareness of ourselves. What we do with this awareness makes all the difference in the season that follows. The second form of crisis is intrusive events. In other words, something externally happens to us or around us in which we have no control. This kind of crisis comes in many forms and usually takes us by surprise. A death, an illness, an accident, a lost job, a broken relationship, an unwelcome move, a dashed dream, a betrayal. Life changes suddenly and unforgivingly. We feel confused and we don't understand. Everything feels upside down and inside out, and amidst the chaos of our external world, God begins gently illuminating some of the chaos within. The way we actually responded compared to the way we thought we would. What life actually is compared to how we thought it would be. Who we actually are compared to who we thought we were. What we actually believe compared to what we thought we believed. And it's in all these little gaps and discrepancies between perception and reality that we are invited into deeper awareness of our own hearts. And finally, the third form of crisis is an internal uprising. This last crisis is a little more ambiguous than the other two, but such an important category to consider. While intrusive events originate from the outside, an internal uprising is the kind of crisis that wells up from within. This could be as simple as a vague sense of restlessness, a whisper that says there has to be more than this. Why are you doing what you're doing? Or it could take the form of stress or burnout or chronic exhaustion, all inner voices trying to tell us something. Perhaps an addiction has grown too loud to ignore any longer, or old wounds catch up with us. And God's invitations into a deeper kind of awareness grow louder and louder, inviting us to listen to what our bodies and stories are saying. While each of these crises have different roots and take different forms, they all have one thing in common. When they happen, we come face to face with ourselves. And here's what I want you to hear. When self-awareness happens to us, it's what we do with it that matters. What do I mean by this? Well, depending on what we do with this jolt of self-awareness, here's the key. It can either increase shame or motivate change. It can either increase shame or motivate change. Have you ever wondered if your story matters? You wonder if anyone would want to read your story, if your story could ever change someone's life, if you could actually write a whole book and get it published. Do you know that I offer writing coaching? Listen to my past client Lauren share her experience.
Hey, my name is Lauren, and I'd like to tell you about my transformative experience working with Taylor in writing coaching. I had an idea that was placed on my heart, and I knew God wanted me to walk forward and put this thought process out there for others to hear. So over the course of several months, Taylor and I met for writing coaching that evolved into her complete investment into my journey. She taught me the mechanics of a book proposal. She provided encouragement. She was always willing to help. And she displayed such poise, patience, and perseverance with me. And I'm a total novice. The highlight was how much fun this process was, and I really, really looked forward to our meetings. As a direct result of Taylor's writing coaching, I was actually able to complete a full book proposal from what was formerly a blank page with a blinking cursor. I pitched my proposal to a publisher, which is something that I'm sure I couldn't have accomplished without Taylor's coaching. I am just so thankful for Taylor's help and mentorship. God really gave me an idea and a purpose, but He also blessed me with an incredible coach and friend to walk the journey with.
As an author of 3 books with 13 years of experience in the publishing industry, I want to help you feel empowered to craft your truest and deepest writing so that you can confidently share your story and the unique message that God has placed inside of you. You can learn more through the link in the show notes. To wrap up this episode, I want to share a story about 2 men. I've been reflecting on these 2 men's lives a lot this past week, and I think we can learn from their stories. They illustrate in such a profound way these 2 different responses to self-awareness, one that increases shame and the other that motivates change. These 2 men were in very similar situations in life. They both experienced the same intrusive event, and they both made a terrible decision within the same 24-hour period. They both regretted their decisions. Both of their decisions also facilitated a jolt of painful self-awareness, but they dealt with this self-awareness very differently. And they both experienced dramatic shifts in their futures based on how they responded. They were both disciples of Jesus. They both listened to his teachings and walked closely with him. But without even realizing it, they were operating on autopilot. Both men thought they knew their hearts, but they didn't. Jesus knew their hearts, and he also knew that they didn't know their hearts. And he had predicted that on the night before he went to the cross, that one of these men would betray him, and the other would deny that he ever knew him. And within that day, both men fulfilled these predictions. One of these men was named Judas, and the other was named Peter. Now, Judas struggled with some integrity issues. The Gospels tell us that Judas actually helped to manage the finances of Jesus' ministry, and he would often secretly help himself to a little on the side. At one point, Judas was motivated to turn Jesus over to the religious leaders of that day, who were always angry at Jesus and trying to arrest him, but could never find the opportune moment. We don't know for sure why Judas suddenly decided to betray Jesus, but we do know this. In Mark 14 and John 12, we see a story about Judas becoming very frustrated about a bottle of perfume. Maybe this was his breaking point, we don't know for sure. But in this story, a woman named Mary brought a very expensive bottle of perfume to Jesus and poured it over his feet. This was done as an act of gratitude and worship, but Judas rebuked her and told her that this money should have been donated to give to the poor. And Jesus, knowing that he was about to die, told Judas, "No, this was done for my anointing." And shortly after that, Judas went to the chief priests and arranged for them to arrest Jesus. They offered him 30 pieces of silver, and he accepted it. Maybe he had doubts and didn't know if Jesus was actually the Messiah. Or maybe his obsession and addiction for more money had blinded him to more important things in his life. So Judas agreed to lead a crowd to Jesus, where he was supposed to greet Jesus with a kiss, the sign that this was the man that they were supposed to arrest. And as Judas approaches Jesus, we read in Luke 22:48 that Jesus said to him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" And there's this moment where Judas has to know that Jesus knows exactly what's happening. But Judas doesn't do anything. He's going through the motions. He's operating on autopilot. So Judas turns Jesus over, and then it's done. There's no undoing. And it wasn't until Judas realized that Jesus was condemned to die that he began to realize that the consequences for his actions were way bigger than he expected them to be. Perhaps Judas believed that Jesus would simply be questioned and then released, and he would have more money in his pocket. But that's not what happened. And suddenly, Judas becomes aware of what he had just done, and he realizes that he was the kind of person who would do what he had just done. And Matthew 27 says that with this awareness, he began to feel remorse. And he tried to confess and return the money, but the chief priests wouldn't accept it. So he went away and ended his life. He tried to undo and reverse and fix and change all by himself, but he couldn't. When self-awareness happened to him, his response reveals that although he may have heard about the love of God, He hadn't received it or trusted in it. And his response increased his shame, fueling a sense of failure and defeat and hopeless despair. But there's another man in this story. His name is Peter. Peter had testified in front of all of the disciples early on in Jesus' ministry that Jesus was the Messiah. He had boldly promised that he would follow Jesus anywhere, even to death. But when the risk of death came to Jesus, Peter denied ever even knowing him. You see, when Judas came with the crowd to arrest Jesus, Peter was there. And as he's standing in the aftermath of all of that chaos, he sees Jesus being led to the house of the high priest. So he follows at a distance. And as he's waiting outside the gate, he goes to warm himself by a fire. And someone recognizes him as a disciple of Jesus. And when Peter is confronted with the threat of being associated with him, he denies it 3 times, emphatically with exclamation points. And at that moment, a rooster crows. And as Jesus is leaving the house of the high priest, Peter locks eyes with him. And Peter remembers how Jesus had told him that before a rooster crows, he would deny him 3 times. Can you imagine the jolt of self-awareness that Peter experienced in this moment? He was exposed. There was no hiding. And the Gospels describe him as having wept bitterly, becoming aware of what he had just done, and realizing that he was the kind of person who would do what he had just done. What he thought he would do hadn't matched up to what he'd actually done in the moment. But 3 days later, after Jesus rises from the dead, John 21 records Peter and Jesus having a conversation about what had happened. Peter still felt shock and shame and grief when self-awareness happened to him. But instead of trying to undo and reverse and fix and change all by himself, he processed it with Jesus, who offered deep and transformative grace, a grace that motivated change. I think we can learn from Peter's story that when self-awareness happens to us, vulnerability and an atmosphere of grace can bring so much transformation when we are willing to take that risk. So to end, I just invite us to reflect on these men's stories and ponder any intersections with our own. Right now, where and how might God be inviting you to encounter deeper parts of yourself? Is there a catalyst that God is using to facilitate this deeper kind of awakening? What is your response? And how might God be inviting you to enter more deeply into his love and transformative grace? I'm so grateful that you listened to today's episode. Thank you for spending time with me. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy or through my website, taylorjoymurray.co. Also, if you enjoyed this conversation, it would mean so much to me if you took a minute to subscribe and review the podcast. This is an easy way to partner with me and is invaluable in reaching new listeners. Until next week.